so much, Ranu, first of all, for joining. And I just wanted to know if you could start off with just giving me a background of your interest in photography and how that eventually led you to a place of looking at print cultures with respect to.
I'm a trained photographer. So my interest in photography, like history of photography, really comes from practice. And at some point, I decided that I really wanted to work on history of photography because I just needed to look back for my own understanding of the medium. And that's when I decided to do like extensive research. So initially, I began working in Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, and eventually moved to the University of Chicago. And while doing my doctoral program, I also like did coursework. So those courses with the different people, scholars, teachers, conversations with friends that enriched my own understanding of modern contemporary art and more specifically photography. So, and eventually all that contributed to my doctoral dissertation and eventually the book that I'm working on and the publications meanwhile that I have had. That's how I came into photography. And I was always interested in intellectual history. So as I was looking in history of photography, it was not simply history of technique, but also history of thought processes. So I wanted to dig into the intellectual history. And to do that, I looked around for stuff and I wanted to look for vernacular writing. So I began with the strongest vernacular I have, which is my first language, Bangla. And Bangla is my first language, and English is actually my second language. So I started looking into late 19th century, especially late 19th, early 20th century Bangla periodical, and of course, newspapers. And needless to say that the reason for looking into Bangla newspapers and magazines were not simply grounded in my access to the language, but also grounded on the fact that Calcutta was one of the main centers of photographic practices in India, apart from other cities. I mean, obviously, it wasn't the only one. And that actually gave a certain edge vis-a-vis what was accessible in the city and how people could seamlessly traverse between London and Kolkata, like and physically as well as mentally, intellectually, through traveling objects and so on and so forth. So Calcutta is where my research begins, but since I look into connected histories, I don't remain bounded by the city or even bounded by what is now our nation state, India or the empire, because what I start looking is connections across cultures and conversations across boundaries. So as much I begin with like the vernacular and the English primarily based in Calcutta, then I just go outwards from and start following the people who traveled, the ideas that traveled, and photographs that traveled. And in the process, I also start looking in the people who came. So it's essentially a conversation, a traffic that I'm focusing on. But at the same time, I want to flag one thing here that as much the photographers that I work on from late 19th, early 20th centuries, like they were writing actively in English language magazines published from London. They were simultaneously also writing in vernacular. So there's an interlink. The history of English language magazines and Bangla language magazines often overlap, and they are not really separated publics. And the people who are engaged in these discourses are also like seamlessly moving between languages and between cultures. And so essentially they form a major part of the cross-cultural conversation. The people who are writing in English are not really translating the same thing in Bangla. So when they're writing in Bangla, they're writing a different thing. And they're not really translating culture. So what they're doing, by writing in vernacular, they're really popularizing a global practice. So it's neither So I wouldn't call like publishing in Bangla a vernacular practice. They were publishing in vernacular without going vernacular. So the photography practice in the city was definitely not vernacular. It was as cosmopolitan and global as you can imagine. But it's the when I use the word vernacular, and this is important to flag, because often people confuse the language vernacular with practice vernacular. So it's just the language that I'm referring to and not the practice. But my research is actually on like 20th century, more generally speaking. So the book project I'm working on, it starts in early 20th century and spans through early 1990s roughly. And again, print culture forms a major part of this narrative because the kind of photographs I look at. So on the one hand, I look at the movement of pictorialism that had huge transactions with print culture, but I also look at documentary photography and photojournalism. And needless to say that they have wide dissemination through print. So that's the other part that brings me to look into history of publishing, print culture, and so on.
Thanks, Ranu. Can you just maybe walk me through a couple of examples of the actual magazines that you're looking at? Could you maybe just give like a brief description, or just some examples of the kind of magazines specifically that you're looking at?
Sure. Like one magazine that I always look at, I've been looking at it for last 10 years, is Probashi. So Probashi is it's a Bangla literary magazine published initially from Allahabad, and later on the publication moved to Calcutta. The other Bangla periodical I'm looking at is Bharatbarsha. It was published from Calcutta. So Probashi, Bharatbarsha, I'm looking at Mukul, that's another one. Then Shilpa Pushpanjali is another one that I'm looking at. There are tons. Actually, there are tons of stuff. Like there's no dearth of Bangla literary magazine. And if you go into Bangla literary magazine, you will at least find one or two articles on photography or and things. But Probashi is one of the major source that I'm drawing on. Regarding English publications, I'm definitely looking at Camera Club journals, but I'm also looking at the proceedings, for example, of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, because that used to be, which is now the Asiatic Society. It used to be the Asiatic Society of Bengal, and their proceedings contain discussions on photography because they were the space where camera clubs were born. And all these are circulating periodicals. And also that will give you a sense of what they are reading, because they will often refer to some other periodical. So once you start reading periodical, you'll get, it's like footnote. So you follow the narrative and the footnote, you follow the footnote, you get into another narrative. So from there, so I move on to then say something like Amateur Photographer, which was published from New York. So that again, I mean, and all the camera clubs are very much in conversation. So these magazines form a major part of my archive on the research related to pictorialism.
Give a little more detail about what the nature of this association was. Like, was it supplementary information to the literary content that was in it, or did photography exist in these magazines standalone as photography, as a form of art in itself?
All forms. So they would be used as, it depends on what kind. So for example, photographs would be used as illustrations for travelogues. They would be used as a frontispiece, like art plates frontispiece, the way paintings would be used. So, and Prabashi is one of the magazines that actively promoted visual arts. And that's the reason I choose the magazine. And they also actively promoted anti-colonial national art. And that's so standalone pieces as art plates, as illustrations of literary content, but also as a subject of its own discussion. So as I said, people would write on photography in Bangla in this periodical, use photographs to talk about the point, or to invite readers' comments, and these another thing, talking about public pedagogy. As much the aim of these photographers were to create a viewing audience, they were also inviting this audience to contribute their photographs to the magazines. So they also sort of created a space of conversation between the audience and the specialists.
A term that you used a little bit earlier was, you said, that the association of photography and print culture, like there was also this idea of public pedagogy. I'm sort of wondering if you can expand on that a little bit more and, maybe point to some examples from the content itself that sort of illustrate this idea.
When the pictorialists in the early 20th century Bengal were writing in Bangla, they were trying to educate people. So educating people was a major impetus for them to write in Bangla. So, and educating people is the starting point of this public pedagogy. And the tone and tenor of this articles would address their readers. Oh, readers, this is better, that is worse. You should do this, you should do that. It was very instructional in many ways. No, I'm not saying that all of them were instructional or all of them had this primary objective of educating, but more or less they were pretty instructional, and they were aimed at creating, educating this general audience. And the term they would often use in Bangla, the word general audience. And that actually like creates a space that there's perhaps something called specialist audience and general audience. And then they were trying to make specialist audience out of general audiences. So it's really once you go through the sentences and read between the lines, you actually see, and choice of specific words. I mean, those are important markers of how public pedagogy really worked in pages of this literary magazine.
I've just been curious, and this is just something that I feel like I've sort of known this about the general culture in Calcutta and in West Bengal at a particular time, which is that there was a certain prevalence of print culture in general, like even outside of photography. And I'm sort of wondering how that overlaps, particularly with print culture with respect to photography. There's the larger ambit of how people are consuming print, and within that, photography occupies a little part, I'm guessing. Or was it far more overlapping than that?
By the time photography comes to print, print culture is not exclusive to Bengal anymore. So if you're thinking of early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, there's sudden exclusivity to print vis-a-vis colonial Bengal. But so you can only start printing photographs on regular papers once you have halftone printing technology. So before halftone, you can't print photographs on regular papers along with letterpress. So that's something to keep in mind. And that's like 1980s. It's the technology is imported in Bengal and in India, more generally speaking, in the 1890s. So by the time, so just think of 1890s. So by the time you are in 1890s, so the print has disseminated across the subcontinent. So while prevalence of an existing print culture in Bengal was definitely beneficial, by the time photography comes to print, it's a different print economy that we are talking about. So there's both, and much of the reason that photographs would be published in newspapers and journals coming out from other parts of the subcontinent, and it's not simply in Bengal. So that's one. The other thing is the stuff that are getting printed in Bengal or other parts, they are circulating. So circulation is a major thing in my story.
My own research, I think, is a little more focused on periodicals and publications that sort of were dedicated to photography. I'm wondering if that's a part of your research as well.
Oh, yeah. Apart from the journals that would be published by Photographic Society for this, for example, Journal of the Photographic Society of Bengal, or Photographic Society of India. Apart from these ones, it's the literary magazines that would carry bulk of the discussion on photographs, and also and when you look at Bangla periodicals, it's always literary magazines and that have other things in the adwell, and they're popular magazines and not essentially dedicated photography magazines. So thinking of dedicated photography magazine, you have to look for camera clubs and those more exclusive spaces. But if you're looking for a more popular discourse and the ways in which a more specialized practice of photography was being popularized by Bengali pictorialist in the early 20th century, you actually have to look into literary magazine and popular magazine.
This is something that you touched upon when you were responding to the earlier question, just talking about your practice in general and why you're not specifically looking at Calcutta and why you're looking at other countries as well. The sort of justification that you provided for the whole idea that Calcutta was sort of inviting a lot of these ideas from the rest of the world, and that it was an important coordinate in this global movement of ideas and photography and a lot of other things as well. I'm sort of wondering if you maybe have one example that you can pull out that sort of explains some of these connections between ideas that are being printed in Calcutta or practitioners that are working here versus also with a foot in the sort of global scene.
One of my protagonists is Ranu Roychoudhuri, photo printing, half-tone technology, and lots of other things. He was a polymath. So that aside, Sukumar Ray, he was also pretty much a polymath. So between these two people, they would publish regularly in British Journal of Photography, then Penrose Annual, and they would also write in Bangla Literary Magazine routinely. And talking about why I pick up Upendra Kishore is as my number one hero because so he's actually researching on improving the half-tone camera and half-tone technology. So it's not like when I say he's writing in Penrose Annual or British Journal of Photography, what I mean, he's writing research articles. So sitting in Calcutta, he's researching and the kinds of research that's getting exported. So as much you mentioned how Calcutta was inviting, but it was also sending stuff that that was being developed in Calcutta. So, for example, without going into too much technical details, because I don't want to make this conversation technical heavy, but he actually, so Upendra Kishore invented a couple of diaphragms and screens that were that kind of revolutionized half-tone printing, especially colored half-tone reproduction. And those researches were published in Penrose.
Another space that I personally am very interested in with respect to print culture and just writing on photography is this whole space of critique, photography criticism, and like really looking at it as an art form, and things like reviews and commentary on other photographers' practices and exhibition reviews and things like that. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what sort of space that occupies within the sort of print culture that at least you've been looking at, and like what sort of magazines would that sort of content normally be featured?
Well, for photography exhibition reviews, again, the space would be English language publications from camera clubs. And if you're looking for like criticism of individual photographs, then you can look for the periodicals that I was referring, the literary journals. This camera club people, when they're writing in Bangla, they would actually use their own photograph to illustrate their point. So that you can see in terms of, and they will critically look at their own practice. And often their articles would be accompanied by photographs by other practitioners, where they would comment and draw attention of the reader to particular aspect of the photograph. It's also kind of public pedagogy that you can think about. I haven't come across a lot of photography exhibition reviews in vernacular, but I've definitely come across is in English language periodicals, and so dedicated photography periodicals. And the stuff I'm looking at, so say Calcutta exhibitions would be reviewed in something coming out of New York, something coming out of London. I mean, these are the major centers, right? So I have come across tons of dedicated photography magazines coming out of New York that are like informing about exhibitions happening other parts of British Empire, including Calcutta, and also reviewing some bit of it and pointing out to specific aspect of those exhibitions.
You made it a point to mention that you haven't been restricting yourself to periodicals or newspapers, but in fact get into other forms of ephemera, like you are looking at manuals and you are looking at other just like print collectibles, which were sort of related to photography. So I was wondering if you could sort of get into a little bit more of detail of what exactly those were. And I think the manuals idea sort of goes back to this fundamental conception of the drive at that time being something like educating the masses about photography.
The instruction manual were not really for the masses. They were so specialized that you need basic training to even read the manual. So, and most manuals are like that. They're very technical. But it depends on what kind of manual. Again, what language, what kind of manual targeted at whom. So if you're looking at, say, 1940s Kodak manuals in Bangla, so Kodak would publish their instruction manual in multiple languages. And so apart from English, they would also have it in Bangla. So those are pretty easy to understand. Like, and we are talking 1940s, 1930s, 1940s. And around that time, if you look at Bangla instruction manuals, they are also pretty accessible, and that's like addressing a general audience. But if you're looking at instruction manuals in the 19th century, late 19th century, they're extremely technical. So, and that's definitely targeted at a more specialist audience. For example, I'll cite the case of Dalmayer, who invented the telephoto lens. So if you read his work on telephoto lens, it's basic optics that he's discussing, and you need to have a basic knowledge of physics in order to access what's going on in that book. And it's all diagram and like stuff like that. So when you're thinking of manuals, instruction manuals, you also have to differentiate between different time periods and different kinds of instruction manuals. So when I say Kodak, I mean, Kodak is they're the box camera company, right? You press the button, we do the rest, right? That was the catchline for Kodak box camera. So all that people are expected to do is to press the camera, and then Kodak will take care of the rest. So obviously it's targeted. So it is a company that was targeting the masses. And it's no surprise that their instruction manual will be easy to access compared to more exclusive manual targeted at specialists. And even now, if you look at instruction manuals, they differentiate. So while we use the word, it's an umbrella term that accommodate different kinds of instruction manual from different time period. And so clearly they have different purposes as well. So that's something I'm definitely looking at, because they contribute. I mean, you can actually find correspondence between the manuals and what people are writing and how they are photographing. So you can figure out what this person is reading by looking at the photograph and looking at the manual, provided you have both. Like, I mean, for that, you have to have both. And there's often one-on-one correspondence, and instruction manual would also have examples, and those examples would often like get repeated. And so that's about instruction manuals. Apart from that, I'm also looking at objects like medals that were presented in camera club competitions, and these were like international competitions. So I'm looking at these medals and the iconographies that the medals contain, and that says a lot about what people thought the photography was and what it was supposed to do. So and I actually look into this crafting of the medal and what purpose it is serving in this entire practice. So that's something. And although medals are not really ephemera the way you say a negative wallet will be an ephemera, but still, I mean they have ended up becoming ephemera. That's one thing. So or newspapers are ephemera anyway. So I mean they're more ephemeral than their shelf life is one day. So when I look at newspapers, they also form a part of this bigger network of ephemeras that I'm talking about. But as I mentioned, negative wallets. So negative wallets are a fantastic source to locate photographers, studios, addresses, because a lot of these businesses, and they no longer exist. Even the buildings no longer exist. So it's totally possible to map the concentration of practitioners and businesses if you are following negative wallets. And then envelopes. I look at envelopes, and again, when I'm looking at them, it's not simply the information they carry regarding the address and the name, but also the kind of emblem they use. So they would often have stamps. So what kind of stamps? So these are also important things. I mean, they also give you access to the kinds of paper that were available. So I mean, basically, I focus on a particular aspect of photography, but if you're looking into this ephemera, it actually opens up a Pandora's box, and you can go into any direction in research pretty much. So these are some of the things. And then also leaflets. So for all these exhibitions and competitions, shows, there would be leaflets, and these are still available. Like you have to hunt for them, but it's possible to figure them out. And they also like posters, like not posters in what we understand as posters, but like small ones, like more of like bills. Like no, poster is not the right word. Handbills pamphlets. These would form other sections in my ephemera.
Maybe just the last couple of things that I wanted to chat about is one, I think a personal aspect for me, I think it comes from my own interest in graphic design and just trying to think about how practitioners who come from a field, come from an art form like photography, sort of, especially those that are interested in print, very often also get into self-publishing themselves. I'm wondering if there were such practices. I mean, there are a few that I can think of with respect to my own research. Like I think I might have mentioned The Camera in the Tropics by A.J. Patel, which was by all means a self-published practice. Like, I mean,
Right.
he had a camera company, he was supplying camera equipment. He just felt the need to sort of go out there and have a publication as well. So I'm wondering if there are examples of practitioners that come to mind who are sort of independently self-publishing because they feel like print is such a large part of how they practice photography.
I wouldn't call it self-publishing because self-publishing has a certain connotation in history of print culture, more generally speaking. But I will talk about like people who are also printers. Like, again, I'll go back to my example of Upendra Kishore. He was a publisher as well. So when he's publishing his own print, he's publishing as a publisher, and it's not really self-publishing the way we understand self-publishing, where self-publishing is often seen as this alternative space to the more traditional publishing industry, and somewhere as if self-publishing lies outside the industry. And so that presupposes a well laid out industrial structure, which wasn't quite the case. And so a lot of these people were publishers. So they would publish as publishers.
Which I might have mentioned to you is there's a lot of publications that I have sort of come across. And yes, I think the one thing that I am sort of interested in researching further, and this is the lens that I'm thinking about looking at them through, which is magazines and periodicals as an alternative space to, let's say, the sort of mainstream that you would consider things like we were discussing this difference between general public and specialized public, and specialized practitioners versus self-trained practitioners. So I'm sort of looking at certain kinds of magazines as being alternative spaces to things like displays, like for example, specialized practitioners who had access to professional exhibition spaces or display spaces where they could actually present their photographs, versus spaces like magazines being alternative in that sense that this is the only space for a lot of photographers to make their work more widely available or to make their work more visible. So I'm wondering if there's some aspect of alternative that maybe makes sense to you with respect to your research as well.
I guess your question comes from a different time period. And for the longest period, I mean, the people you call professional, they're all self-trained. And the operative word for the longest period is really amateur. And when the word amateur is employed, it's not really in terms of their practice, but amateur as in photography as an artistic hobby. So, and hobby was given a lot of premium. So hobby is something very sacred, and you don't encash hobby. So, and that's exactly where amateur come in. So all these people that I'm talking about, they're all self-taught. And when they have like more institutional training, like say Sukumar Ray went for printing training in a school, but his initial training were all like in his father's press with his father. So amateur is really the word. And if you're thinking of pictorialism, something that we discussed earlier, well, amateur, that's the word, and that's the word across the world. And that's why a lot of specialized photography journal would be called amateur photographer, for example, or amateur photography. And in this case, the kind of amateur professional you will employ, say today, where it will indicate some sort of skill set, that if you're a professional, there's a particular skill set you have. If you're an amateur, you lack particular skill set. And what you're saying, access to certain things vis-a-vis not having access to certain things. These were very, very different, like for the longest period in the history of photography. So the question that you are posing is really a recent question. And also not so recent, because the kind of segregation you're talking about, that's getting broken down in spaces like, say, Kochi Biennale. So where you have general uninitiated audience, quote unquote uninitiated audience, going to this contemporary art shows. I have strong reservation about about the word alternative, because if you're using alternative, you're also presupposing a mainstream, and to think about a photography exhibition as mainstream for the longest period of time, once again, is anachronism, because like photography made it to the galleries. It's pretty recent. It's a very recent history that, and if you track back, like when it's like gallery oriented photo. I mean, there are examples, of course. I mean, MoMA had photographs from the 1940s, I think, and then Alfred Stieglitz had a gallery in the early 20th century. He started off as a pictorialist, but moved on to do something, became a modernist eventually. So he had a gallery which was dedicated to photography. But apart from these examples, it wasn't as ubiquitous as we get to see now. So it's not like every neighborhood gallery would have a photography show. So I wouldn't really call magazines as alternative spaces and exhibitions as more mainstream, because magazines were really the mainstream. And we are talking about a pre-television era where you only have magazines and newspaper, and that is the mainstream. And also I mean, exhibitions, like circulation through exhibition and circulation through print, are two different structure altogether. And I would not really compare exhibitions with periodicals. I would put them both side by side as intersecting spheres of circulation. Yeah.
I agree with you that maybe the word alternative might be more fitting for a slightly later period. I think the space that I was thinking about when I was thinking about exhibition and display practices was, in fact, the much longer history of salons and photo exhibitions that are sort of coming out of these photographic clubs. And those as being a sort of staple for people who consider themselves practitioners versus, you know, people who would have to become members of such a space to sort of be a part of this exhibition making process or this exhibition display process. So I think maybe those were the sort of examples that I was thinking about. But I agree with you that maybe the word alternative might be more fitting for a slightly later period, because there's a starker distinction between the different spaces that are being inhabited by two different kinds of practitioners.
Oh, well, that's much later. And anyway, I mean, what becomes mainstream today becomes like alternative tomorrow, or what is alternative today becomes mainstream tomorrow. So the idea of mainstream and alternative are also shifting. These are shifting categories, really. And to talk in terms, to take them as fixed boundaries, to understand circulation practices can be a little tricky. Yeah.
All right, Ranu, I think that will be
All
about
right. Thank
a
you so
lot
much.
that I was wanting to discuss with you. But thank you so, so much.